Hello and welcome to the first episode of my new podcast, Agents of Hope. My name is Tim Cox. I'm a trainee educational psychologist and I have a passion for education, psychology and positive social change. I've set up this podcast for people who are interested in any of those things, and I'd really like it to be an open discussion between myself, between the guests that I have on and the people who are listening. So please follow and subscribe to this podcast and follow me on Twitter. My Twitter account is TimCEducation, and please give me any feedback that you have about today's episode. The first episode I've called Listening for Hope, and it's a conversation that I had with an educational psychologist called Joe Taylor, who lives and works in London, and we talk about a range of things, including how we got onto the training course to become educational psychologists and the values that underpin our practice. Then we have a bit of a discussion about narrative therapy and how that can be hopeful, and then a similar discussion about consultation and hope. And then we kind of conclude our conversation that we had planned by talking about hope in adverse times. We conclude by trying to answer some questions that we had posed to us on Twitter, and really it was a really entertaining and insightful conversation for me, so I hope you enjoy it. Sit back, relax, and let us know what you enjoyed. Thank you. Welcome to the first episode of my podcast, Agents of Hope. My name is Tim Cox. I am a third-year trainee educational psychologist studying at Newcastle University, and I'm also on placement in Tyneside as well. My guest today is Dr. Joe Taylor. Could you give me a bit of an introduction to who is Joe Taylor, what he does, what are your interests, what are your influences?
Yes. Firstly, it's really exciting to be on a first episode. That's really cool. I also love the name. In the preamble, I was wondering about asking if you thought of a name, but Agents of Hope is that's awesome. So I'm Joe. I'm a psychologist, educational psychologist in London, and who am I? I'm from an area called Hackney, which is it's North London, and it is very diverse, and it's now it's full of hipsters now, but it used to be a relatively poor borough, and my schooling was really mixed and really wonderful in lots of ways, and that made me really interested in education. I was a young carer, and that also got me interested in barriers to attainment, and I trained to be a teacher. I also started up and ran and then closed down some edu startups. And I actually applied to train as an ed psych from a place of being a founder of an edu startup. Clearly they also saw there was some merit in what I was doing, because I got a place on the course. But I'm really, in hindsight, I'm really thankful that worked out, because it's definitely the best job I've ever had. I recognize in hindsight now that it's a bit of an unconventional route in. So that's a bip about me. I also train Thai boxing. I like yoga. Those are things I'm interested in. I did my thesis on boxing.
I saw that.
Of boxing as an intervention, which also I had a whole other plan about trying to look at how EPs could support initial teacher training. Which I thought could be really cool. And then my partner Kate made me reflect on that halfway up a mountain, and was just like, do you really love it? And I was like, I don't love it. So
Okay, yeah.
But yeah, I changed, and so that's what I looked at, and I'm interested in. I'm at a point in my ed psych career where I'm quite early stage, I suppose.
Okay. So
I
how long ago did you qualify?
uh, it will be 2 years in September.
Okay.
Is that
Okay.
right? Yeah. So I suppose I'm interested in everything. I feel like I'm constantly trying to limit what I'm actively researching because
Yeah.
there's so much I have to learn. So, I'm really interested in dynamic assessment. I'm
Okay.
really interested in supporting people, looking through a lens of developmental trauma.
Okay.
Um, I find myself really interested in the therapeutic aspect of our
Hmm.
work, and especially
Okay.
like what that looks like in a school. Uh,
Yeah.
and I'm training to be a VIG practitioner, video
Oh,
interactive
awesome. Yeah,
guidance.
yeah.
Um, so yeah, I kind of, there are lots of things I'm interested in. My reading list of articles to read ranges from like flow states through
Yeah.
to um, motivation, different types of motivation, uh, through to self-actualization. So like really kind of humanistic
Yeah.
theories. Uh, I found myself really loving psychodynamic theory,
Yeah.
which I've gone on a real journey with, and
Mm.
I'm reading Winnicott. Winnicott wrote a kind of collection of cases and
Yeah.
compiled them.
Okay.
Um, so yeah, that's like a mind dump of everything I'm interested in at the
Yeah.
moment. Yeah.
I was interested when you're talking about kind of your kind of edu startups. What is that? And because there's a lot of people who might be coming to listening to a podcast like this with an interest
Yeah.
in educational psychology and kind of a passion for it, but from lots of different backgrounds. So I don't know what one of those is. So could you just summarize that?
Thank you. Yeah. So an edu startup it's a startup, so a company that's still trying to work out its business model
Okay.
within the education sector. So when I was teaching, I I love teaching. I never actually officially stopped being a teacher.
Yeah.
My appendix ruptured, so
Right. Okay.
I kind of I was forced to leave my post for health reasons. But then in the recovery time, I essentially got some funding for a startup idea that I had,
Hmm.
which was about trying to connect parents into school,
Great.
school life.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the way that we tried to do that was by letting teachers share their students' work,
Okay.
using a website, and then there were plans for an app. So what is it? An edu startup? Yeah, it's kind of like a fledgling idea.
Hmm.
In terms of me, I suppose my entire career really has been about trying to improve society through education.
Yeah.
And I, yeah, I suppose I felt like when I was teaching, I saw different things that frustrated me or I thought could be better. And
Yeah.
those were my attempts at trying to fill those gaps or work in those areas. And
Yeah.
actually, I found myself a little frustrated about the lack of evidence base behind what I was doing.
Okay.
I was drawing upon evidence from my experience from within the classroom,
Hmm.
but hadn't really drawn upon any research evidence or really any broader evidence from other teachers.
Yeah.
So I found myself missing the psychology of my undergrad, and that was
Okay.
kind of how I found myself wondering whether I should apply for the ed psych course.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's kind of my roots.
Yeah. I mean, mine was slightly different than that, I guess. And it's really interesting here that you've taken quite like a creative route. And I don't think there's one fixed route. I mean, being a trainee at the moment, you come into kind of constant contact with people who are trying to apply or on courses in different places, and the different stories that you hear are really kind of like it makes you think there's a real wealth of kind of different skills in this, and that creativity, that kind of way of thinking about a problem, I guess, it's probably really helpful in that kind of traded relationship. So do you work in a traded way, or because in the Northeast that tends to be the way that we do things, and that for me opens lots of opportunities, although it can be quite uncomfortable for other people.
Yeah, I think all of the local authorities I've done placements in or worked in have been mostly traded. So I suppose for people that don't know what we're talking about, that means that schools have a pot of money that they choose to spend on ed psych time, and there are still some places in the country that instead of the school receiving that money, the local authority receives that money, and so the ed psych service is nominally free for schools, but the money's coming through a different avenue. In terms of my experience, I suppose it means I'm in quite an interesting position because I work for most of my week in a local authority.
Yeah.
And local authorities are really big organizations, and they have lots of processes and structures. And my professional experience is either in a classroom where I've been in charge of my classroom for the most part, or in a startup where I'm kind of making up the rules with my team, and it's really kind of bottom up, emergent. So I think that can be really useful, and it can also lead to frustration, and it can also lead to amazing problem solving, and it means I've got a lot to learn as well about that kind of big scale stuff.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of brings me on to kind of the next section of what I kind of like to discuss is like how we got to this conversation that we're having right now. And I guess for me, I took a different route into kind of psychology. I didn't study it at school at all. I didn't study it for undergrad. I studied history. I was always interested in those kind of why are we like we are questions, and history was my way of looking at that. I was brought up in like a religious household. My dad's a vicar, he just retired, and he had real views about this is why we are, and he was pulling from a theological basis of that and a scriptural basis, which didn't seem to resonate with kind of my experiences or my things. So I looked at history to kind of look at that, and then I went and studied at university. And in our first semester, the first thing that all the history students had to do was like discuss what's the point in history, and the conclusion was, well, there isn't one.
Yeah.
Because it's all too personal. So I found that really difficult to kind of assimilate with, and kind of those were my first. I guess that was kind of my kind of baptism into thinking about society in a different way, thinking about social justice and making society better through something. And looking into the past, it didn't seem to be that thing. Although it was interesting and it taught me a lot about, how we've got here. And what
was your first encounter with psychology?
Well, I was working, so I left university and worked as a non-teaching pastoral head of year in a school in Hampshire, and I was really terrible at it, like really bad. And I'd never been bad at anything really, apart from football. But I didn't, I was deluded. But it was, I was bad at it, and I thought like, there's got to be some evidence base out there which helps me to understand this. I was really interested, I was working with, young people, year 8, year 9, going through adolescence and coming up against problems that I'd understood, but all I could see in the mirror when I went home was, you're acting like the teacher that kind of didn't understand you, didn't get you, didn't respond to you. So that's how I got interested in young people. And then I basically stopped doing that job and moved back to Wales to have a semi-unsuccessful music career. And at the same time, I was working in a pupil referral unit. And part of the job there was to be the outreach worker who kind of bridged that transition between being at the pupil referral unit and back into mainstream school. And I worked alongside an EP then. So it was kind of very kind of hands-on, very lucky just to fall into that position. And then I went back to the school in Hampshire that I'd worked in before and applied that, and I noticed that kind of, I guess, in more settled mainstream, all those ideas were really, really powerful and helpful. I thought, okay, that's the thing that helps me to understand and be competent at this job, and that's what seems to be the most meaningful thing. And kind of alongside that, I was also having kind of my own struggles with kind of mental health and depression particularly, and I kind of, my way of dealing with that was reading. So I kind of came across, you know, psychological literature and kind of existential kind of fictional literature. I thought this says a lot about my life. So I decided to go and study a conversion course at Bristol, and kind of drop everything, go to a new city, and had a lot of time. And I kind of read Frankl and Fromm and kind of big existential psychologists at that time. And through that decided this is what I want to do with my life. It's not to be a better head of year. It's what if I can apply psychology, that's what I'd like to do. And then I worked for 3 more years in mainstream schools and then applied for the course. And luckily, at that time I was working in Newcastle and I got in at Newcastle.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's been crazy. And then coming onto the course, it churned everything up, and I thought that I had something settled, and like, this is who I am. And then I really looked at those things. I guess what's led me to this conversation was I found first year really difficult, having never worked in an educational psychology service, or, you know, apart from those few months with a psychologist. I kind of thought I really had to think, like, what's at the basis of this profession and what makes me tick? What's the common ground between that and the people I've worked with in schools? Because I want to do the best by the kids and by the people I've worked with. And that seemed to be hope. So my second year, I kind of got obsessed with the idea and wrote loads of extended pieces on hope, and really like annoyed all my tutors and other trainees by just talking about it all the time. But in September last year, I kind of put together something and submitted it for publication. It got published in last month's DCP debate, which was brilliant. And I presented on it at the Trainee Educational Psychology Conference in Northampton in January. And since then, I've kind of gone onto Twitter and found out there's actually loads of people who are interested in that. And that's how we kind of started having the conversation. Yeah. And realised actually there is people who are interested in this. It isn't just like me being a sad little loser in my room being obsessed with hope. You know, there's people who want to talk about this thing.
Yeah.
And what I found really difficult when I first started training to be an EP, it's like, what is an EP? What does it do? And I knew within myself that it was a powerful thing, but I couldn't really say what it was that was powerful about it. And I told that to my supervisor, supervision, who said, it's weird, isn't it? Because you can't pull one thing that pulls everybody together. And I took that as a kind of challenge, and I went away and listened and shadowed people and thought, what is in everybody's practice?
Yeah.
Hope.
I think just to add to that, I'm really thankful that you wrote about hope and published that article and presented on it, because it crystallized something for me. Really just what you said in terms of hope is at the heart of psychological practice. I think more profoundly than that, hope is part of being a human.
Yeah.
And I'd never thought about it until you started talking about it. And that, you know, that's one of the wonderful things about being in a profession where people are thinking and putting stuff out there. You know, it reframes and gives you different lenses for all of your practice. And I really love, I just want to kind of highlight what you just said in terms of, you went away with this challenge, like, what is an EP? and what you came out with is it's about hope. And I really love that. I think that's a really elegant, it's such an elegant answer, but it's really profound. Like I think it does a lot in terms of it's one of those things that it just, like, you hear it and you're like, yeah, that just sounds really right. So yeah, thank you for doing that. But also, what a wonderful conversation to have, talking about hope.
Well, I hope so, and I hope people kind of get stuff out of it. And you kind of hit on something there about it being a human, about it being about existence, and it's, you know, that's, it makes everything link up for me, from being somebody, a history undergraduate, and, you know, you're looking at, you know, people's experience in the Holocaust, absolutely terrifying. It seems like another world, but what links you with those people? Well, Frankl says that that's hope, and that hope brings you meaning in life to get out of the hard things. So it made me kind of crystallize, you know, why is history and literature great? Because it talks about these ethereal, inarticulate things.
Yeah.
And then we can, you know, if we can map those out into psychological practice, and you know, tell people, you know, we can do all of these kind of intense consultations, therapeutic practice, assessment, whatever, but if that brings hope in your life, that's brilliant.
Yeah.
You know, and I think that is almost to every single EP that I've ever spent time with, and actually every teacher, every parent, every child, they've all got some element of hope.
Yeah.
So why don't we talk about it in that language, rather than kind of, I guess, a little bit more kind of despairing or technical. And, you know, I was listening to your podcast with Sue Roffey this morning, and she was talking about, you know, academics talking in language that's only understandable to them.
Yeah.
You know, for me, it's like that really resonates. And it's like, yeah, we've got to be talking about something which people understand. And I honestly think that every human being has got a relationship with hope.
Yeah, for sure. I think I haven't read about cross-cultural experiences of hope. I wonder if you have, but I would struggle. I'd struggle to argue that hope isn't central to human experience. It just seems to be such a primal thing, and because it's about, even when things are hard, it's about, on an experiential level, why do you keep going on? And I mean, this, you know, this is philosophical perhaps and not psychological, but I would argue that it's about the fact that you think something might change. So I did a narrative therapy course, and during that course I had my practice really challenged, because some of the questioning styles that I was being exposed to seemed really rigorous, or no, not rigorous, vigorous, and I was a bit uncomfortable. So for example, you know, there was this role play. Somebody put their hand up and said, I really struggle when I have people come to a therapeutic session and they're problem saturated, and I feel like I make suggestions and everything I say, they always have a negative answer, and, you know, they really articulated this point and it resonated in the room. So the teacher that day said, okay, let's role play that. So this person kind of got up ready to do their best problem saturated impression. And the teacher, just in the first 15 seconds, said the script was something like, so you've spoken to lots of professionals, none of them have been able to help, you feel like things are really difficult, why are you still coming back? Why did you come today? And I was sitting there going like, wow, that's really, I don't know, that's a bit like assertive. Are they ready for this? But actually, the key thing is that immediately it reframed it towards hope, because that person then thought and said, why did I come today? Because I feel like maybe deep down something might change for the better.
Yeah.
Immediately, it was such a I'm going to use the word elegant again. It was such an elegant question because it just changed the whole conversation about, well, what would you like to be different and how would you like it to be? And I suppose I kind of view that as a really a hopeful style of approaching therapeutic conversations.
I think that's absolutely right, and that's kind of really interesting. Like, narrative therapy for me was something that kind of really resonated about kind of, I guess, that untangling problems in that questioning way, and reauthoring and sustaining new stories. It's really hopeful at the bottom of that. And I think there is a couple of things that I thought about when you talked about there that kind of popped up in my kind of consciousness, is that although it's not a psychological thinker, there's a politician called Tony Benn, and he talks about, to have progress in your life, you need two flames. The first flame being the flame of anger, and the second flame being the flame of hope that something will get better. And I think often psychologists are coming where the flame of anger is perhaps, or despair, or whatever that is, perhaps it is burning and has had more fuel than that of hope. And it's, for me, it's about, how do we start fueling that hope? What's a small enough goal that's meaningful in somebody's life, that plays into that idea that it's going to get better.
Yeah.
And that takes it from, I guess, wishful thinking, which, can be kind of a really horrible thing to think. It's like, this is just wishful thinking. That's a horrible thing to contend with. To, okay, what's a small enough but meaningful enough goal to make it not wishful thinking? And how can these people help me to get there? And how will they know? So, I mean, that's why, I guess, there's an idea about catching hope, which is, like I said, this is kind of what we kind of talk about, using that kind of narrative therapy idea to kind of manifest into conversation. But it's like, how do we build from there? So could you tell me a bit more about the kind of narrative therapy, and whether there's anything more kind of hope-based there, or, what are your thoughts on narrative therapy in general?
Well, I think that what I really like about narrative therapy is that it puts the person that you're working with at the center of the conversation.
Yeah.
And it really, in terms of the practice, gets you into a habit of checking that you understand. And I think that it made me realize how much I might have assumed I understood people before.
Okay.
And it also got me into the habit of using people's exact language.
Yeah.
So in conversations, repeating people's language back to them, but also in my reports, I started including kind of quotes, direct quotes.
Mm-hmm.
And I really like that, because it's like you're bringing the person into the report, and it becomes their report and not your report about them. Yeah. I think that it's powerful as a tool, because sometimes people feel stuck in a story that is really difficult, or they live in a situation where people are telling stories about their situation, or about them, or about their group, their demographic, their life experience,
Mm-hmm.
which is judgmental. And there's something in the practice. So you get these in the training that I did. You kind of get exposed to these almost like frameworks for conversations. So how to guide people, the maps, exactly. Yeah. How to guide people through this, navigate these mm-hmm. conversations, and help discover values that are important to people, and help check whether you found an exception to a particular narrative. And I think that those preferred narratives are often more hopeful than the ones that people might be telling about themselves. and I use these techniques in my consultations quite regularly. I had a case with a woman who was 16,
Mhm.
and they have had a really complicated family history. There has been lots of violence. There's been lots of time away, and we're not sure exactly what happened during that time, or where they were.
Okay.
So there's lots of reasons to be worried.
Yeah.
And in my first session with this woman, I'll be honest, I was feeling a bit out of my depth.
Mhm.
and, and my alarm bells were going off a bit, and I was thinking maybe I need to recognize that I'm at the edge of my competence at the moment, and this was kind of going on while I was trying to be present with them, and
Yeah. Mhm.
and I'd asked a question about the fact that throughout this entire history that I was hearing about, the young person had always come to school,
Mhm.
and I just checked in with that, and they said it's because I'm a resilient person.
Okay.
And I just thought, now suddenly we're talking about something completely different. The whole mood in the room changed, and that gave me a spark to use Tony Benn's analogy,
Yeah.
right? We have a flame of hope, and wait, Tony Benn or Nigel Benn?
Tony.
Okay, phew. And I was like, I don't want to get my Benn.
Nah.
Get my Bens mixed up.
Subtly different.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, now we have a spark of hope, and can we fan that into a flame? And so we could talk about other times when they felt they've been resilient,
Mhm.
and so the whole conversation opened up. So I think that's a really nice example of how I felt the conversation changed, and
Mhm.
suddenly the person was talking about completely different experiences, and the techniques of narrative therapeutic practice allowed us to kind of find or capture
Mhm.
some hope.
Yeah, I mean that resonates with some of my experiences on my placements, is that I've been really interested in applying the ideas, and I was expecting Senkos and teachers to be quite wary of it or a bit suspicious of it, because it's kind of post-structural, not necessarily going to have outcomes which are applied in school. But I was asked to do a couple of kind of groups earlier this year. But what I found was, I guess, like you in some ways, is that I was going in situations where the teachers perceived that these children had negative stories about themselves and generally lacked self-esteem or were vulnerable. And actually doing, I guess, therapeutics, I was using kind of tree of life and forest of life approaches. They were actually pretty happy with their lives. Um, and I guess that kind of tells you at least tells me, just to be, I guess, critical of those sort of referrals in terms of, is this their story or is this your story?
Yep.
But I think stories are incredibly powerful ways to communicate what life's about and where you want to go. So it's certainly something that I want to, I guess, read more about once I've got my thesis done.
Yeah.
And there's certainly some really kind of talented narrative psychologists up in the Northeast. Luckily, I live with one, so hopefully I can kind of draw on her experiences.
Brilliant.
What kind of, for anybody who's interested in narrative therapy, what books, what articles, is there any kind of videos or anything like that somebody could go away and say, right, that's what it is. Okay, let's look at applying this in my EP practice or school practice or whatever it was?
Yeah, definitely. I'm just going to turn on the light because I feel like the light coming in through the window is now no longer sufficient.
That's fine. That's fine.
We're going to go technology-based light source.
There we go.
Ooh. Okay. So I think that we're talking about sources or resources.
Yeah.
The Dulwich Centre has got a great website with lots of articles on it. The Institute for Narrative Therapy is based in the UK. That's who I did my training with, and they do too. Michael White was the founder of the approach, and has written lots of different things. Some of the books can be quite hard to find or a bit expensive. But there's one that I have called Maps of Narrative Practice.
Yeah.
I think that you mentioned Tree of Life.
Yeah.
And I always said the name as Nkube, but on my narrative therapy course, I got told that actually the correct pronunciation is something like Nkube. And
I'm clicking it. Okay.
There's a little click that I'm probably not quite aware enough to put in the right place, but I think that there's a particular document that I'm thinking of which has, I think it's on the Dulwich Centre's website. It has background about how the approach was used and developed, and that was my route into awareness around the approach. So I was using Tree of Life before I knew anything about the principles of narrative therapy. I mean that's probably true. And so,
but I think that's an element of narrative therapy, although the literature around it can be difficult to take it all in at once. Actually, the artifacts of it, the practice of it seems just to resonate with people, and they kind of get it because narrative is your story.
Yeah, exactly.
And that resonates with people.
Intuitively, it felt like an approach I was comfortable with, and as a tool, I felt like the Tree of Life could be quite self-contained. Now that I've done some training, and I think I've probably got better as a psychologist, I think there's a lot more that can be done with it, and I view it much less as like something that can be done in an hour versus a process that could be done over many sessions. So I think that was my route in. Those are the resources that I think that I think I refer to. The course that I did through the Institute of Narrative Therapy was about £500 for 5 days, which I mean it's a lot of money, but I actually think for 5 days it seemed like good value. I know that they do courses across the country, so that's probably something that I would look into if psychologists are interested.
It's something that's part of the training at Newcastle.
Really? That's cool.
So it's kind of, I guess it's enshrined in the way we could think. Although, it's like, I will say it, like some of it is moving and difficult to manage, I guess, in that training. And it wasn't for everybody, I don't think. But it kind of really resonated with, I guess, my thinking kind of around Frankl and Eric Fromm and people like that. It's like, what are the stories that give people life and give them meaning? And I find that fascinating. I guess a book that I found really helpful at kind of laying it out in an easy to read way was Alice Morgan's, What is Narrative Therapy? An easy to read introduction. And that's just helpful of just kind of summarizing. So if you're not in a place to, I guess.
I also totally neglected to mention playful approaches to serious what is it called? Playful Approaches to Serious Problems.
Okay.
It has a yellow cover and
Okay.
it has purple people on it.
Okay.
That was something that I bought when I was a trainee. That I think is probably somewhere in between reading an intro to the Tree of Life and doing a course. It
Okay.
might be, a nice entry text as well.
Yeah. I mean, we could put links, I guess, into bios or whatever. I don't know about this whole podcast thing, but I'll take your lead on that. Okay. So you kind of mentioned kind of other approaches. So we've got the kind of therapeutic approach, and I guess with looking at those hopeful stories and stuff, we talked about on Twitter about kind of hope in consultation. Could you, I guess, summarize in 2 sentences for people who don't know what exactly consultation is in EP practice is? Here we go, I'm testing you now as a qualified.
Wow. I mean, I don't know if you can summarize. Can you summarize consultation into 2 sentences?
Okay, what would it look like to somebody who wasn't an EP?
Okay, so I suppose the basic vehicle of consultation is a conversation between 2 people, or at the minimum, and a group of people at the maximum. And there are lots of different schools of thought on consultation. So I think that some people view consultation in terms of gathering information about a case. Some people view consultation as therapeutic in itself. Some people might view consultation as a way to go through an entire process. So you might decide on a topic to talk about, gather information, co-create some ways forward, think about how you'll know if they're successful, and then decide another time to talk. So that, all of that could happen in one meeting. I think that the way that I use consultation really depends on the school that I'm working in, the type of case, also the people that come to the room. Sometimes I think I have an idea of how a consultation is going to go, and actually there might be a parent there that really needs to take it in another direction, and I follow their lead, and we end up doing something really useful that I hadn't intended. So that is a classic psychologist answer to a really simple question.
I think you did a pretty good job. It might be a paragraph, not 2 sentences, but I think I agree, and that's a helpful way of looking at it. And I guess it does depend on, I guess, your relationship with perhaps the school that you're working with, or what type of work you're brought in to do, whether it's kind of very short or it's kind of a long-term relationship that you might be having with that school. And I guess hope in consultation for me happens in 2 ways. One that I think really relates to the last bit of the conversation we're talking about. I'll sit and I'll listen for hopeful stories, and sometimes that's everybody's hopeful, and sometimes it's the exception. But it's I'm thinking about what's going well here, and how can I build on that, and what are the features of that. And I guess I use hope theory as a framework. So to briefly go over what hope theory is it's very basically, it's the sum of your agency, so how confident you feel about yourself being the author of your own success, and your pathway thinking, which is the different ways that you can think of getting that success and what's cause and correlation, and what you'll go towards your goal, and whatever that goal is, how precise that goal is dependent on the person. So I'm actively listening, I guess, in consultation for times where that group of people, that person has set a goal and they've hit it, and how they've hit that, and what were the different ways that they tried, and how agentic they feel about that. And this is why I think it's really important when I work particularly in consultation with young people, and you'll be able to tell me lots more about it because your thesis was on it, but that really digging into their interests and the stuff they're really good at seems to be so powerful in my practice. And then I guess, you know, I can come across a child who's interested in Minecraft or Lego or something like that, say, okay, what are the skills, what are the pathways to hitting the goals that they set on a regular basis? Because this person can do it because they're doing it in this particular arena, and how can we transplant those skills into a school setting? And how do they get feedback from when they hit goals, whether it be boxing or in a video game or playing football or playing music, and saying, okay, this is clearly something that works for them and makes them feel confident, makes them feel authentic. So let's just try do a bit of that and see what happens. So I guess there's the listening way. I don't know if that's something that resonates with you or.
Yeah, I think that's a really powerful description of EP practice, listening for stories of hope. I think initially my take on the idea of hope in consultation might have been focusing on the technique of the reframe.
Okay.
So trying to wonder if there might be a hopeful interpretation behind a situation. But something you made me think of when you were talking is I think a bit deeper than the idea of a reframe. So I think something that's quite powerful about hope is it has to be genuine, it has to be authentic. So I went through a period of time where I was really interested in positive psychology as an evidence base. And I think one of the biggest criticisms that I had of positive psychology was that sometimes it could be used in a bit of a tyrannical way. So for example, list me your strengths. And it's like, but right now I don't feel like I have any strengths. Or, okay, tell me 10 good things that happened today. And it's like, nothing good happened today. So there could be a top-down misuse of the idea of positivity. And I think that hope is very different because in order for it to be defined as such, it has to resonate with the person. And so I think that it's for me, it's kind of it's a wonderful middle ground. So it's a way of thinking about how you can help people have more feelings of happiness without falling into the trap of that top-down practice of hitting people with the baton of positivity.
I think I mean that's interesting. I was reading a English literature book talking. It's called Hope Without Optimism. I'll put the link to it in the description. But basically, the thesis is this: is that he argues that people who are professionally optimistic, are very annoying, and actually, it's shallow. It's a shallow hope. By just saying you've got all these strengths and it's fine, that puts, it really kind of puts people out of concern because they're like, well, you're not listening to the adversity that I'm facing. So his idea is that hope is a really useful idea of saying, right, yes, things are bad, and yes, you have strengths, and let's use the strength to find the light. And there's a great poem by Charles Bukowski where it's called The Laughing Heart, and it's about, I go back to it almost weekly because it really sums up my view on hope. And he talks about, keep on the watch. The gods will offer you chances and you need to take them. You can't beat death, but you can beat death in life sometimes. That's beautifully kind of sums up, yes, things are really difficult. Suffering, I believe, is part of life. But there are opportunities to build yourself and to live a life which isn't continually suffering.
Yeah. I hadn't heard of that poem before, but yes, that was a really nice line.
Yeah. I mean, I think, I think this kind of, I often talk about hope in consultation with people, and often use it, as you're saying, the kind of reframing, that kind of genuine summary of what I've heard. And I tend to use, I guess, hope-led consultation tools, stuff like kind of person-centered planning, things like planning alternative tomorrows with hope.
Yeah.
That's kind of a centerpiece of my practice. And those things start with a question: what is your dream? What's your life going to be? Would you like your life to be like? And once you've focused on what, that question is about, if things were possible, then that's fine. Then you can get onto the nitty gritty of what's actually available right now.
Yeah.
So people can have the big dream, and that's brilliant because that drives their life. And then have the kind of smaller incremental things which are more boring. But if you can say all the things that you're going to do in school can link up to that big goal, that's such a powerful thing, of reframing of what school's about. Where there's quite strong narratives about schools. I think about schools being oppressive and like prisons, and I've got to do my time. And it's something I brought from my time as a head of year. It's like, what if you thought about school like a shop, where all the lessons were aisles where you could take things from? And they seem to get that more than me saying, well, school's a bit like a prison.
Yeah.
You just got to do your time, keep your head down, because there's no meaning in that. It's all for the school. It's not for the person. So I think you're right about saying it's about finding what's genuine, what's motivating for that person. Yeah.
I love that analogy. What if school was like a shop? Yeah. Because you don't take everything from the cereal aisle, but you do. Something catches your eye and you say, yeah, I'll take that.
Because it links to something else in your life outside the shop.
Yeah.
Like, whereas
milk.
Yes. Well, or like, I can go into a shop and I can buy this thing because it makes me feel this way about my life. That's a very inarticulate metaphor, but I think it's, children and young people can tend to tell you what they want, and they tend to, I guess, be told off a little bit for telling people, I want this, I want that. But actually, it's a really good starting point, I think, for people.
Yeah.
I think the other way that I try to use hope in consultation is when I guess what I'd call, well, I wouldn't call, but it would be called process consultation, where I'm doing it over a long period of time, particularly with teachers and special educational needs coordinators or head teachers who I've got a long-standing relationship with, is using every individual piece of casework as a way to make them more hopeful about the school that they're running, or the department or the class that they're running, and pointing out the hopeful things that they're doing, because I think there's a performative culture to teaching. You'll know more than I do, having been a teacher. And then I think it's powerful when somebody comes in and tells you, I think this is good, man. You're doing the best that you can with that situation. I mean, I don't know what your thought is on that as an ex-teacher.
I think I really liked teaching, and I don't think I ever really thought about it on that macro level. I think at that point in I think it's probably, I didn't teach long enough to get experienced enough to have my head up that much. But having worked with lots of teachers now, I really like what you're describing in terms of using those contact points and moments with them to build and contribute to this overall narrative of improvement or hope or success or helping. I think that I'm just remembering consultations that I've had quite recently where teachers have left the room feeling happier about the situation. And sometimes it's the smallest thing. It's just acknowledging that they've been putting a lot of effort into a difficult situation,
Yeah.
and that they've stopped it from getting worse.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't sound very hopeful, but actually for them, just having that recognition completely changed their emotional state, and they left feeling happy, like, oh, somebody's noticed. Yeah, I'm not doing this in vain. So yeah, I like that. You called it process consultation, which is interesting, because I don't know that much about process consultation, but I hadn't ever thought about it like that, as kind of across multiple sessions.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it's my interpretation of process consultation, where the idea is everything is an intervention. And I guess what I mean by the intervention is like everything about education to me, whether you're a teacher, whether you're a parent, whether you're a child, you learn something. Otherwise, it wasn't worth it. It's dead wood. So if I can say, look, even if something's gone wrong in a piece of casework, or a child's been excluded or whatever, it's like, what have we learned? And how does that, how can we take the lessons of the individual and put it towards the group, or, make it help other people? I always I remember my first year in school as a pastoral head, and I'd come home, day of shouting, no voice, having no positive feedback about what I've been doing. It was well intended, but it wasn't working. And I looked in the mirror and thought, I didn't set out to be Miss Trunchbull. No one ever does, and teachers under a lot of pressure. So I think, as much as, we can work with young people and families, I make it a point that I don't assume that the teacher is just a role. And there's a person there who can also be more hopeful about their life, their role. And if I can facilitate something towards that, then that has the double-edged good sword effect of, it encourages to trust and see things as a process, as an ongoing learning thing, which helps to manage expectations. Like, no one's got a magic wand, although everybody expects somebody to have one. Yeah. And that trust allows, I guess, the Senkers I'm working with at the moment, they've allowed me to be more creative and try new things, because it's going to be discussed with them in that manner.
Yeah. That's a really nice description, I suppose, of how relationships and the understanding that you're on the same team can lead to more flexibility. That trust is a foundation to, okay, I mean, Tim wants to do this flip chart paper drawing exercise. We'll see where it goes, because I know it's well intended, and I know that other ideas have been useful in the past. And there's a psychologist called Karen Treisman who I really like and respect. She has a quote which is, every interaction is an intervention. I think that is such a good quote. I wish that I think probably every psychologist wished that they'd come up with it. But I feel like it really links to what you're saying, in terms of, when you're in school, you have the chance to make, that teacher in the corridor feel seen, or that Senko running between meetings feel slightly more calm, or whatever it is. And those micro moments can add up and really change the school culture over time. Yeah,
I think so. And it all starts with relationship, I think. And I think it's easy to think of these environments and schools as toxic. That that's something that jarred me a little bit in your conversation with Sue Roffey, although I'd never openly criticise her to her face, obviously. But I think.
Well, criticism doesn't have to be
Listen,
bad.
criticality. I think it's that criticality. Okay, I don't think schools set out to be toxic. There may be schools that don't fulfil child's emotional needs all of the time, and that's an ongoing journey about learning, helping, containing, and that's something that EPs could definitely do. And she poses us as agents of change, and I've taken it and just shifted it a little bit, I guess. But I think schools are full of hopeful people.
Mm. And I mean, I want to know what Sue thinks about that. Yeah. I'd love to hear a comment on what you just said in terms of that toxicity and yeah. I mean, I'm not even going to comment. I'm going to leave that, and then she can let me understand.
Yes, he quakes in fear now. Okay, I mean, I guess the last thing before we kind of get some questions that the Twitter EP community have posed to us would be we thought about kind of hope in times of adversity. Clearly, we're in uncharted waters for our generation, really, in terms of adversity, and I think it's been horrifying and worrying and I guess traumatizing to a degree in terms of people's, and certainly my perception of what my normal life is has completely fallen, the bottom of it's fallen out. Yeah. And there have been times where it's hard to be hopeful in that situation, and I'm just kind of wondering on a human level what things have you been getting up to which have at least, I guess, not been terrible, like you said in Consultation? What are the things that have made this kind of COVID-19 situation a little less adverse for you?
Yeah, I think the first thing really is just to recognize the emotive element of the situation for myself. So it's been really hard in points. It's been really amazing at points. So things that have been particularly hopeful for me, seeing people being really kind and generous and innovative, not even in a professional context. I had a neighbor, big up Layla, I had a neighbor come and drop off a box of gloves because they knew that we were going to be getting some groceries for somebody else, and so they were like, here's, we didn't even ask, we didn't even know that Layla would think to come to our house like that, but but she did. And just that moment, it was like, oh, I know they're doing something to help, so I'm going to do something to help. And it just, that just encapsulated something that is there if you're in a position to see it. So some days I have felt really worried about what the future holds, and so I'm not really in a place to connect with hopeful things like that. And other days I feel like I wake up and I actually feel like I'm surrounded by people doing amazing work, and that this is an example of everything that's incredible about humans in terms of generosity and audacity and working really hard to help other people. And so I think that that's a kind of a narrative that I really liked noticing.
And I think what's wonderful about that is that it's provided a counter narrative to, I guess, the past 3 years, which feels like society in the UK has been completely polarised on some sort of indefinable issue around the European referendum. But now the chips are down, people are, there's still politicising of the situations and the what ifs and they should, but people are coming together to a large extent to kind of come towards a communal goal and helping people out in the little ways that they can, setting those small incremental goals, which is meaningful and helpful to somebody else, and bonds those kind of trustful relationships. Like, I hope, those things continue beyond, whenever this ends, or at least people are mindful to the fact that people are doing the small things. And it's those things that kind of keep us ticking over.
Yeah.
And I think, hope can be described as a really dangerous thing. I think at the start of the conversation, you talked about kind of cross-cultural ideas around it. And certainly I think in Judeo-Christian societies, it's seen as a wholly positive thing. But in some cultures, it's seen as really dangerous, and it's the last thing left in Pandora's box. So in that culture, it was seen as kind of don't ever get your hopes up, because you'll always have them dashed. So I think I wouldn't necessarily go around preaching a hopeful way out of the situation when I don't have, I guess, the agency or pathways way to think that would just be wishful thinking. And I think there's a lot of kind of willful thinking going along at the moment. So willful thinking is you have to do this thing and achieve this goal or else. And there's kind of a lot of anger, I guess, that I'm seeing on Twitter, particularly, and Facebook, about people choosing different things, or people being key workers or not. Mm-hmm. It's difficult, man. It's a strange situation, but I think hope can be helpful, but it's like timing when you're going to talk about hope. I think is good.
That's a really interesting point. So I'm just thinking about the last few weeks for me. I let all of my schools know that I'm there if they need help, or they want to talk. And then I gave them a bit of space, because I just thought there's so much for them to process and organize. Like staff rotas, calling families, who is vulnerable, all of these things. And then I just kept on checking in, really, and acknowledging how difficult the situation was. I don't know, it's funny. I think the hope was only in my head. Like, at some point, I think they'll be in a place where I can be useful, because before that, I felt like, schools were in such a reactive place, because they had so much to do and there was so much fear, and so talking about hope then would have been annoying or offensive. But now we have a few routines in some of my schools which are helpful, and I think once I was able to start being helpful, then I felt more hopeful, and I think then that allowed me, or empowered me, or encouraged me to feel like the school was also starting to see some other possibilities in terms of how we could work together. But when does one mention hope? Potentially the word hope, could be a bit inflammatory. Do you ever name hope in your work, like consultation wise?
I think in summaries I often say, I've heard some hopeful stories in the room today, and these are them. And they're important because they tell me this about this group of people. And this is your goal going forward. And you could draw upon your experiences of those hopes that you've had, and those fulfilling activities that you've done together. The fact that you've got yourselves together in a room to talk to, a lanky 6-foot psychology student about important things in this child's or this school's life, shows me that you can set goals, and you've got the pathways between you to feel agentic about going forwards with it. And maybe it's just about I guess what I'm doing there is that I'm giving them feedback, because that's a really important part of hope theory is the feedback, because that sets off how we intuitively think about hopefulness. And I guess in the timing element of it, I think it's always important to say there is some hope, however small that is. And I think that's gone through my educational practice, where I've been working in schools or working in the psychology service, is that if people can leave with some sense of hope that something's going to happen to make it better, or things aren't quite as bad as they seem, then that's good. And I think maybe just holding those hopeful ideas in your head, and sometimes you've got to keep the hopeful story in so as not to be professionally optimistic. And then it may be, using a narrative therapy idea, it's like having that narrative letter. They're really powerful ways to just think about an email and just say, I noticed this today, I didn't say it at the time, but maybe that tells you something about the way forward.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think there's timing. It is a difficult thing, and maybe it's an intuitive, you'll feel whether it's right or not, like you kind of described earlier on in this crisis, wouldn't have been helpful and might have inflamed situations. But I think what you said earlier in consultation about hope being genuine, people come to you with their hopes if you ask the right questions. So waiting for those conversations to start and then saying, okay, there's an applied psychology to that as well as a nice idea. And this is perhaps a way forward towards something which isn't quite as catastrophic.
Yeah. That quote really stood out to me. People will come to you with their hopes if you listen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I like to start consultations with that question if I can. What's the dream? And then you're instantly galvanizing what those people in the room can do towards that. Because often, the dream, the hope, is absolutely reasonable.
Yeah.
It's not like I want to, it's not like a 6-year-old saying, I want to work for NASA and be a professional footballer and all that sort of things. I think as psychologists, we're able to unpick what people's hopes are. And usually I want a normal life. I want, I was talking to a 13-year-old who's between schools at the moment. And he said, Tim, what I want is a job. I can have a good work-life balance and I can have a relationship which works for me. It's like, fine. Absolutely. Look, there's nothing unreasonable about that.
Yeah.
And feeding that back to schools and stuff, like, okay, we can do that. Yeah. It's not intangible. It's not like this child is being unreasonable. It's like, oh, okay, we can work towards that, and education can seem like less of a drag.
I haven't ever thought about this before now, so I don't know where this will go. But I wonder if maybe there is a flip side to hope, which is shame. So if I'm putting myself in the position of the child you just talked about, if I'm embarrassed about that desire to have a job with a good work-life balance, or I don't think it's possible and I don't feel able to articulate that, I could imagine that there's this shame which bubbles under in it, and it could really be hard to feel. But in naming that hope and having it validated by other people, I can imagine that being such a lovely moment, or such an affirming moment. I don't know how that strikes you, but yeah, I'd never really thought about hope and shame and the link. But
yeah, I think that's really important to bring up. I guess my way of thinking about that is, when I was at school, I got by okay and coasted and got into a uni, and that was fine. And it was only after I finished that uni and kind of coasted that degree, because I was just like, didn't really I knew that I had to do something in order to get a good job, but no one had ever asked, what do you want to do? Apart from a careers advisor who printed off a sheet and said, right, go and be a journalist.
Yeah.
Because I said I like football. And that was it. So I thought, okay, well, I'll just kind of coast through life and I won't ever refine what that goal is. And then I got out of uni and wasn't very good at what I did. And I wasn't preparing for that. I hadn't thought about how can education help me to go and fulfill that goal. So I guess those kind of questions come from a place of like, I wish somebody had asked me, because then it would have made everything more bearable and it wouldn't have been such a catastrophic blow when things didn't work out and I worried about what everybody else thought, because that's why I was doing it. Whereas if I thought, okay, what's my internal motivation for this earlier, that probably would have been quite helpful. And people, I tend to say precisely what it is, and it takes that thing out of the murk. So at least that you've got that thing that you can say, okay, school is a process towards getting towards that thing, and some bits of it are hard.
Yeah.
And some bits are really unpalatable. But that, if it links to your dream and your hope, great, let's do that.
Yeah.
Let's do that. And that sounds quite dismissive, but actually, I think it can be quite a profound experience for a young person to think about that.
Yeah.
And it also links back into the work I was doing in pupil referral units, where it was seen as this huge task to get the children back into mainstream school. And part of what I do with the EP was to say, what do you want to get out of it? What would help? What your challenge is? Go and have that conversation with them, with a head teacher, a head of year. And all of those children stayed in mainstream school.
Yeah.
Because they felt I've been listened to.
Yeah.
And this links with something that's important to me.
Yeah.
But yeah. If it's okay, Joe, I'll move us on to some questions that I've had from Twitter.
Yes.
Some of these we might have touched on before, but it'd be good to have a 10-minute conversation about them. I'm aware that time's moving on. So Laura from Twitter has asked, how do we get the balance right between a foot in pain and a foot in possibility? And in addition to that, do we sometimes push through pain to get to hopeful situations too quickly?
Did you say that Laura asked that question?
Yeah.
Wow, that's such a big question. And if I'm honest, I don't know. I think, so just before lockdown, I found out that I had got a travel research grant. So I hope at some point I will be able to fulfill that. But that was all about researching compassionate and mindful approaches to suffering.
Okay. ...
as a way to help people experience that in a potentially transformative way. So I feel like there's real wisdom and possibility in suffering. I think that sometimes we can ignore the fact people have a foot in pain, or we can try and force them to take their foot out of pain. And I think that can be really difficult. I think that sometimes people will always have a foot in pain, and that's where they are, and sometimes their foot will be in pain for reasons that they can't control. And so if we can't ever remove that reason or facilitate that change, we need to be thinking about what we can do alongside it. I'm thinking about the contemporary resilience research base in terms of some risk factors will always be present. We need to try and tilt the balance with protective factors. So I don't know, Laura. I think it's a massive question. I think it's a really important one, but I also think that it's quite natural to want to help, and I think that sometimes that can lead to rushing people or invalidating experience or ignoring experience. And I think that, yeah, pain is important too. What do you think about
Well, it kind of makes me think a bit of some of Viktor Frankl's work. He was coming up with his kind of logos therapy idea in a concentration camp. He had several foots in pain there, and it was about how do we make life worth living despite the pain, despite the suffering. And I think people will always have a foot in pain. That's part of human experience. If we can help them to be mindful of the ways that they've coped with that to date, and to apply psychology in order to alleviate some of that suffering, or at least allow them to feel agency and to kind of flip that, how does this suffering make me an expert in something, and how can I help somebody else? I mean, lots of psychologists tell me a story around that idea of, I had this painful experience and psychology helped me to think about how I could help other people in that. And I think that's a really powerful, meaningful story to live out. So I think, yes, we do come upon people who are in pain and who are looking for a kind of a step forward into possibility. But I think you should be mindful of, they may carry that pain indefinitely, but that's not necessarily despairing. That can be hopeful.
Yeah.
It's what's the biggest chunk of that pain that they can carry and be still useful and still fulfill all their needs in life, and then what can people take off them? So it's not doing stuff for people, it's helping people to plan those things out in life. So I think that would be my argument, although that doesn't directly answer the question. But
great question though.
It's a great question. And Laura asked another question, and it's the last question. Are some people better at doing hope, and do we need to be aware of privilege in that?
Wow, I think I had a few immediate reactions to that. The first is that I think personality psychology would probably argue that some people are more predisposed to positive affect or rumination. I think that I don't mean that in a deterministic or negative way.
Yeah.
I think that if you looked across a population, it probably would be true that some people were naturally more hopeful than other people, or naturally held less firmly onto failures or difficult experiences. I think that hope probably facilitates hope to some degree, and there we start to edge into the territory of privilege or opportunity. So some people definitely have easier lives than other people, and there's some people do hope better than other people. Yeah, I mean, I think those are my immediate responses to it. I think that doing hope is an interesting phrase, though. I don't know how you take that.
I mean, I'll bounce an idea off you, which is, I guess, something I'm looking to publish going forwards about hope. Is that I looked at hope theory, and Snyder, who is your kind of main hope theory guy, positive psychologist, basically argues that some people are low hope individuals or high hope individuals, and that's context and platform independent. So they're either hopeful or they're not. I disagree. I think whatever we hope for is ecological, essentially. So we take cues from our environment and the people around us as to whether how hopeful we are at doing something, and that means that we draw upon how agentic we feel, how many different ways we can think about something, and how precise the goal is. Some people might be more in the discipline of doing that successfully. And those people might have more privileged positions in society where more opportunities and resources have been put into helping them to do that and fulfill hope. Although I would say that, people also have their level of suffering, and that's never a privilege. So regardless of what privileges you do have, I think there's a counter to that. But what I'd argue is that I draw on Jonathan Haidt's work about kind of moral decisions and stuff, is that there's an intuitive emotional element of hope. So if I set you a task, you'd have an intuitive, automatic reaction to that. Do I feel hopeful about doing that? Or that's never going to happen. And everything in between those two things. Then you have your evidence-based hope. So Snyder says you have your hope thoughts from the past. So what's your evidence that you've been able to do that? So you've got your emotive or intuitive hope. Then you've got your evidence-based, which leads into like how much you care about that goal going forwards and how genuine it is. And then you have your experience-based hope, which is your experience of applying agentic thinking and pathway thinking towards a goal and what feedback you got from that. And therefore, I'd argue that some people in some situations are going to be more hopeful in that situation. If I came to your martial arts gym, I wouldn't have a hope in hell. I've done one boxercise class, my legs hurt and never went back. But put me in front of a room of people and I'll sit and play guitar and sing to them, because that's something I've practiced. That's something that I've dedicated time of my life to. So I think you can be disciplined in hope, and you can be privileged in hope. You can also be disciplined in it. And I'd suggest that we shouldn't give up on the idea of hope, because some people are more privileged in getting their hopes fulfilled. If we're disciplined about it, that means that we set small enough goals that are meaningfulness, like you would in the gym. If you can't lift something, you go to something that you can lift, but it's still a strain, and you work up to going to the big goal. And that's what I think we do psychologically. That's what I think I do psychologically, is help people to identify goals and work up to those goals by having mini goals towards that. Don't know how many times I think goal in a sentence, but I think that's the way I'd kind of look at that question. Is that we often work with people who aren't privileged, and we can, as a predominantly white middle class profession, I think there's a danger that we could come across as privileged, but only if we see it as something which is static and doesn't, you're either hopeful or you're not, and that's it.
I like the way that you framed it in terms of ecology. So, even if we accept that some people have a predisposition biologically to experience more or less positive states or rumination, you still within your family might see people approaching situations in certain ways, or showing working through adversity. You might then in your community, society, politically, you might have all of these different systems around you,
Yeah.
Which could show you that hope is possible, or that you talked about your evidence of hope. Was that
evidence? Yeah, intuitive evidence and experience-based hope.
Yeah. So I suppose then as an agent of hope, you might find the smallest weight that someone can lift to start giving them that evidence. And so that just strikes me as kind of a wonderful intervention, really. So even if you didn't have the biology, and you didn't have the family, and you didn't have the society, I feel like humans are, we are adaptive, and we can learn, and so why wouldn't you be able to learn hope? But the question was about doing hope, and I think that doing hope's interesting because it makes me think of output.
Yeah.
And I could imagine somebody walking around feeling very hopeful and happy and content, and actually not producing output which people would judge hope by. But I really like the different layers that you laid out, and I wanna read more of Snyder's work on that. That sounds really cool.
Yeah. I mean, the key thing that perhaps I left out there is feedback, and that's something that EPs, friends, family, other kids, teachers can do. Yeah. And a question I ask in consultation is, how will you know when you've achieved a goal? What will other people be doing, and how will you feel?
Yeah.
And people will tell you, I really like it when I get a postcard home, or I get a thumbs up, or whatever it is. It's like, okay, we don't have to reinvent the wheel. They're telling us how to do it.
Yeah.
So just, and that feeds back into your intuitive reaction, your experience base, your evidence base.
Yeah.
And makes you more. I'd say that makes you more of a hopeful person.
Mm-hmm. And starting with them helps to facilitate something that's genuine, and it avoids what we were talking about before, which is this kind of top-down, judgmental positivity. The young people that worked with me for my thesis research talked about this wonderful cycle between having just enough trust in their boxing trainers to allow them to push them really hard during training, and then surpassing their expectations in terms of what they achieved, leading to more trust, leading to being comfortable being pushed even further, and you had this wonderful virtuous cycle.
Great.
And it strikes me that fits really nicely in with the model you described, and the feedback was from the people around them, but also in terms of the actual changes in their technique and their performance and all that kind of stuff. And I could see how you would then experience hope across all the dimensions that you outlined. That's a really, I'd never heard it framed like that. That's really useful.
Well, maybe it's a co-publication in waiting.
I don't know. I feel like that's your publication in waiting.
But that very nicely illustrates it, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And I mean, I think if people can link up with these ideas, that's good for the profession. That's good for society. Yeah.
No doubt.
Well, I've noticed we've tipped over 90 minutes, which I think this conversation's been brilliant and hopeful, and a really good experience for me doing my first podcast. Have you got any kind of closing reflections that you'd like to finish on?
I'm so glad that we took the time to talk. I feel like I have been facilitated to think about my own practice by your questions. I feel like I've learned a lot about hope, which is really great. Philosophically, but also practically, I feel like I'm going to be able to do different things in my work now, which is really, really, really cool. I think that it lays out a really interesting model for other psychologists out there. We all end up with these kind of, you know, we have skills in common, and we have evidence bases that we draw on that, you know, might be more or less popular. But I think that just through the nature of our work, it does get quite individual sometimes in terms of, you know, your interests. And I feel like, yeah, these kind of conversations help to kind of share and mix and turn things into quite an interesting cocktail. So I think that it's a really cool model. And I'm just thinking about clinical psychologists and counseling psychologists, and, you know, countless other applied psychologists who could be having these kind of conversations, and I wonder what cool stuff could come out of it, basically.
Yeah, I'm absolutely open to any suggestions and all. You know, I think the idea of open educational psychology is a good idea, and having these conversations, long form conversations, and for people to kind of stick with it for an hour and a half, whatever, that'd be lovely to have feedback about anything that resonated and anything like that. So I think I've said all I can say. My face is now very red, as it has been the whole. I don't know. It's not like my girlfriend's mum said. You look peaky and pale about 10 minutes before I came on.
There you go. Yeah, exactly.
And now I'm just flushed. But there we go. Hopefully I'll get used to it. But thank you very much, Joe. It's been an absolute pleasure. And I don't know how we end this, but yeah, again soon. Why not?
It's been a great conversation. Yeah, and let's keep talking. And I can't wait to hear what people think, and to hear other episodes of Agents of Hope.
Awesome. Great stuff. Okay, thanks, Joe.